an extremely timely and relevant discussion about the Black Lives Movement and anti-Semitism within the Black Lives Movement. Ever since the horrific murder of George Floyd in May, many Jews have felt compelled to join in with the demonstrators. Compassion for the underdog and the impulse for social justice is well within the Jewish tradition. We Jews have always felt what it's like to be an unwanted, despised minority. It is this compassion for social justice, as I just wrote in a piece in Newsweek.com, that led Andrew Goodman and Michael Schwimmer to give up their lives registering Blacks to vote in Mississippi. And it's what Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel led to link arms with the Reverend Martin Luther King in 1965 in a march in Selma, Alabama for equal rights for Black people. But we know also that there's a very, very disturbing trend within elements of the Black Lives Matter movement. As was said at a demonstration last Thursday, people were chanting over and over, "Israel, we know you, you murder children too." And they interspersed that rhetoric with Black Lives Matter, Palestinian Lives Matter. And of course, on June 19th, Linda Assor held a rally with her group Muslims for Abolition, and she said it was open to all minus cops and Zionists. Here to discuss this very disturbing trend are two incredible experts that I go back a very long way with. Carolyn Glick is a senior columnist at Israel Hayom, and she writes frequently and is a contributing editor at the Jerusalem Post. You see her all over. She writes frequently for Newsweek.com, for JNS, Israel Hayom. She's the author of an outstanding book, The Israel Solution, which I have helped pass throughout Capitol Hill. She is a real force to reckon with. And I'm proud to say she's part of our advisory board at Emet. Charles Jacobs and I go back till about 1989 or 1990. He has given birth to so many phenomenal organizations, including the American Anti-Slavery Movement, the Americans for Peace and Tolerance. He's also was responsible for the founding of the Boston division of Camera, and has contributed far beyond and above anyone that I know to the discussion of incredibly important topics here within American Jewry. So it is my esteemed pleasure to first invite Carolyn to discuss this disturbing trend within the Black Lives Matter movement and what is going on currently in the American Jewish community. Carolyn, please.
Hi, thanks so much, Sarah, for your kind introduction. Thank you for everybody who's tuned in for joining us in what I think is a very important discussion, really not only for the American Jewish community, but I think for the United States as a whole. And that is the question of Black Lives Matter's anti-Semitism. A couple of weeks ago, I wrote a column in Israel Hayom, where I explained that actually it isn't that anti-Semitism is some sort of an accessory that you see at odd moments with just sort of bursting out from Black Lives Matter. It's not a bug, it's a feature in the organization. The anti-Semitism of Black Lives Matter is systemic. It's inherent to the movement. It's part and parcel, it's inside the fabric, woven into the fabric of Black Lives Matter, and I'll explain. First of all, we have to remember that when Black Lives Matter first published its platform in 2016, that platform was overtly anti-Semitic. It accused Israel of committing genocide against the Palestinians. It accused Israel, it called Israel an apartheid regime. It said that there are 50 laws on the books in Israel that deliberately discriminate in a racist way against Arabs. And it joined forces, it joined Black Lives Matter officially with the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement against Israel. So all of these things are clearly anti-Semitic. And one of the things that I think is important for American Jews to understand or to think about when they think about the BDS movement is that they say that it's a boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement against Israel, but really it's directed directly against American Jews, because what they do is not impacting Israel's economy. It impacts Israeli academics who want to come to the United States, but really only at the margins. What we're talking about mainly is overt and deliberate discrimination against American Jews, and specifically, as we see, their focal point is U.S. college campuses, and it's against Jewish students on college campuses. Anybody who is a Zionist, supports Israel, wants to express their support for Israel, is hounded out of the public square in campus after campus after campus. We're having severe civil rights violations of American Jewish students at almost every campus in the United States. That's all really emanating from the BDS movement that Black Lives Matter is a very important member of. Now, why did this happen? Well, it happened, I would say, for two reasons. One of them is that beginning, I think, with Ferguson in 2014, and the early sort of creation or evolution of Black Lives Matter from a series of other Black groups, Black action groups, you had a deliberate and very targeted lobbying of Black activists on the part of anti-Semitic Arab activists like Linda Sarsour. You had CARE, also the Committee for American Islamic Relations, and other groups, Adala, the Israeli Arab irredentist movement in Israel that has a very active chapter in the United States. This is an organization that calls for Israel to be prohibited from being a Jewish state. All of these groups were actively lobbying, working with, insinuating themselves inside of the Black Lives Matter movement as it was being created. So they were there really on the ground floor, and at all of the Black Lives Matter or pre-Black Lives Matter protests in places like Ferguson and in Florida, you saw people, Arab anti-Israel activists standing with placards saying things like from Palestine to Mexico to Ferguson, we're all victims of these terrible people. And I, of course, just ruined the slogan, but whatever it was. I mean, constantly drawing a parallel between Palestinians who were supposedly being discriminated against by Israel, by the Jewish state, together with Blacks who claim to be discriminated against by the American government, by local authorities throughout the United States, and of course by police. So that was one aspect of it. Another aspect of it is the very pedigree of Black Lives Matter. Black Lives Matter, sort of an amalgamation of three main groups, two of which are very clearly anti-Semitic organizations, and that's the New Black Panther Party and the Nation of Islam. And then there's another one, the Dreamcatchers, who I don't know that much about, but I've also seen indications that they are also an Islamist anti-Semitic group. So at least two out of the three components that joined together to form Black Lives Matter are very, very viciously anti-Semitic. And so it sort of naturally unfolded that the group that they would form itself would be an anti-Semitic movement, a Black anti-Semitic movement. And that's, in fact, what transpired. Well, what's interesting, I mean, there are several things that are interesting about this. One of them is that in 2016, when the Black Lives Matter platform was initially published, you had a very significant outcry from Jewish organizations, including far left Jewish organizations like Rabbis for Human Rights, which is now called Truah, who are objecting to the false accusations against Israel. These are organizations that are truly radical leftist organizations. And yet they were angry because they said there's no such thing as genocide in Israel. The Israelis are not carrying out genocide, and you're discrediting yourself and making it impossible for us to participate in your operations, which we desperately want to do, because as Sarah said, liberal Jews have always been actively supportive, enthusiastically supportive of all efforts to strengthen the position of African Americans in American society. And so they wanted to support Black Lives Matter from the outset, but when the platform was published, they felt constrained to object because these were blood libels against Jews and against Israel, and they didn't. And even the most radical Jewish organizations in the United States could not support them. So in the event, 4 years passed, and we had the killing of George Floyd by the Minneapolis police officer, and Black Lives Matter again emerged on central stage in the United States in the middle of a presidential election. And here you see a response from the Jewish organizations, the organized Jewish community, that's very different from what happened in 2016. First of all, they're denying that there is a platform, because the original Black Lives Matter platform was removed from the internet. And now you can find it under the Movement for Black Lives, which is an umbrella organization that encompasses not only Black Lives Matter, but another 19 organizations. And so there you find the same accusations against Israel. And here what's interesting is that if you go to their website, you see that actually the accusations against Israel are not in a specific area where they say, here is Israel's rap sheet. No, it's, again, when I say that it's structural anti-Semitism, I think it becomes very clear when you look at where it is. The parts about Israel in the Movement for Black Lives Matter's platform are in a general paragraph. I have it on my website, carolynglick.com. You can look at it, that deals with divesting from the U.S. military-industrial complex. Okay, and so what Black Lives Matter does is that, again, when I say it's woven into the fabric of the movement, you see that on their platform itself, their discussion of Israel is part of a broader discussion about the evils of the United States. And here, what's most pernicious is that they say that U.S. military aid to Israel causes two problems for the United States. The first is that it makes the United States complicit with genocide, which they allege that Israel is conducting against the Palestinians, and that Israel is an apartheid regime, which means it's also evil in that sense. Not only are they Nazis, but they're Afrikaners. And since they're so evil and the United States supports Israel with military assistance, that makes the United States guilty by association of Israel's crimes. So the United States, by supporting Israel, is responsible for genocide and is supporting an apartheid regime. So it's part of a wider libel against the United States. The blood libel against Israel is part and parcel of the broader libel against the United States. And the other thing that they say that's also pernicious is that they blame what they claim is the lack of welfare funds for Black Americans on American support for Israel militarily. Now, when you look at the amount of money that the United States spends on its military budget every year, not to mention the amount that the United States spends in places like NATO, the idea that the aid to Israel is somehow or another, responsible for the military industrial complex in the United States is, of course, absurd. But then again, so are all of their accusations against Israel. Not only absurd, they're monstrous. And so what they say is that as a result of American military support for Israel, there isn't money for welfare for the Blacks. So effectively, they're saying that Israel is responsible. Oh, and Israel is also responsible for the war on terrorism that the United States has been waging since 9/11. So Israel is responsible for all of the terrible things, all of the wars that the United States is involved in, which is, of course, all evil. And also Israel is responsible for the urban blight in the United States and for all of the problems that have befallen the African American community, because the aid for Israel is what's pumping aid, is diverting federal dollars away from the inner cities and towards the military-industrial complex. So this is like 360-degree anti-Semitic movement. And what you have among the Jews in response to this is complete denial of what's happened. So I cannot say how many times I've been, after I posted the parts of the Black Lives Matter or Movement for Black Lives platform on, of course, my Facebook page and then on my website, I keep getting bombarded by requests, but everybody's denying this. And please give us more documentation. And look, I'm not a researcher. I went on a Google search and this is what I came up with after 1 minute. So I would assume that anybody with a modicum of curiosity could find it themselves. And yet every single day I get another 3 to 10 requests for documentation of my claim, because apparently there's widespread denial of what is written and what they're party to, even as the actual anti-Semitism is literally hitting Jews in their faces, like happened at the organized attack by Black Lives Matter activists against the Jewish communities in Beverly Hills, Beverlywood, and Fairfax, Los Angeles, over the Shavuot long weekend of Shavuot and then the Sabbath of Shabbat, where Orthodox Jews were out of commission. And you had over half of the Orthodox businesses, or Jewish-owned businesses, largely by Orthodox Jews, in the Fairfax district of New York were looted, as were 5 Jewish synagogues that were vandalized and 3 Jewish schools. So this was an out-and-out deliberate attack against the Jewish community of Los Angeles, and you had almost no response from the Jewish community except to say that they have to do away with their white privilege and understand and feel the pain of their African-American neighbors who just destroy their livelihoods deliberately because they were Jewish. And so you had that. You have in New York City, Jews actively marching with Black Lives Matter and then keeping mum on the Black Lives Matter's own attacks on Jews. So, an aspect of this that's important to bear in mind, of course, is that 2019 saw the largest recorded level of anti-Semitic attacks in the United States. This is, of course, after Poway, which was in November. Not Poway, the Tree of Life massacre in Pittsburgh. And most of the anti-Semitic violence was taking place in the New York metropolitan area. So that's Brooklyn, all the 5 boroughs, and New Jersey, and Rockland County and other areas. And what the police department of New York made clear over a course of time, after a lot of denial, which was that the perpetrators of the attacks were not white nationalists. They were largely minorities, and they were largely African American. The most deadly attacks against Jewish Americans in 2019 were carried out by African Americans, both the massacre of the Satmar Jews in Jersey City and the machete attack that killed 1 and wounded, I think, 5 more in Monsey, New York, over Hanukkah. So, the Jewish community is being victimized by Black anti-Semites in a very clear way. You had daily attacks against Jews in Brooklyn and Crown Heights and Williamsburg and Borough Park in 2019, and yet today you hear no outcry, the overt discrimination against Jews by New York Mayor and Black Lives Matter supporter Bill de Blasio, and you have no significant outcry of American Jews about the systemic anti-Semitism of Black Lives Matter. To the contrary, you have a very large-scale denial of it. This is maybe related to the presidential election, that they're part of a broader Democratic Party coalition, that as overwhelmingly Democrats, American Jews don't want to get on the wrong side of. But I think that the outcome of this is the disenfranchisement, to all intents and purposes, of American Jews inside of the Democratic Party, because when you don't command respect, you're treated with contempt. And I think that you're seeing this more and more with the willingness of African Americans and other progressive parts of the Democratic Party to truly attack Israel supporters in the United States, much less Israel, at will. You saw it in the defeat in the Democratic primaries by Elliot Engel, by a man who opposes limitations on government investments in firms that support BDS, and obviously overt support for Black Lives Matter on the part of his opponent. So I think, you know, the less willing American Jews are to stand up for themselves and their rights and to call out Black Lives Matter for its anti-Semitism, the more likely we are to see a lot more anti-Semitism emanating from the progressive wing of the Democratic Party, and specifically from Black Lives Matter. And I'll leave it on.
Thank you, Caroline. Very, very well said, very alarming. Here to talk a little bit about the ideology of this, about Louis Farrakhan, and how there is systemic racism within the Black community in terms of their ongoing slave trade that's happening to this day, is the really great Charles Jacobs. Go ahead, Charles.
Okay. Thank you, Sarah, for reading those notes from my mother. Look, to be on the same planet as Caroline Glick is a blessing in itself, and to be in the same webinar is a joy beyond imagination.
Yes.
And then to add to this that it's Sarah's Emmett webinar is Sarah, the America's Jewish warrior. This is more than I can handle, I think. I want to talk about an issue that can help us fight and maybe even deliver a significant blow, both to intersectionality and perhaps even to Farrakhan in his own base. Hold on a second, where did my thing go? There we go, okay. So a few words on Farrakhan, who is now the most popular and dangerous anti-Semite in America, and he is. Of course, neo-Nazis and white supremacists are surely a problem for Jews, but polite society rejects them. Their best effort to date, which was a national rally in Charlottesville, which we all remember, drew a few hundred people, whereas Farrakhan's rants excite adoring crowds many, many times that size. And as if you know anything about his July 4th 2-hour presentation to the nation, which was hosted on the website of P. Diddy, the rock star, who has 500,000 viewers, you'll know that Farrakhan's influence is growing and growing. And unlike at alt-right rallies, a Farrakhan event will never be shut down by toughs who are throwing fists. That's never going to happen. Farrakhan also has open sympathizers in positions of power. And so what Louis Farrakhan says about Jews will only reach more and more people. I watched his 2-hour July 4th address to the nation. Jews, he said, hinted strongly poisoned him, over-radiating him for his prostate cancer treatment. And the Jews are imposters. How are the Jews imposters? Well, they replace their Torah, which is the word of God, with the Talmud, which twists God's message. So this, by the way, is straight from the Islamic tradition. That's what the Muslims say. So I just want to give you a slight taste of, if you've forgotten the old Louis Farrakhan, he's gotten much older now and he's much weaker, which is good. But just play the first slide, if you would, and we'll just play a few clips from there. Hope you can hear it.
Alana, if you could play the first slide.
Yeah, 1 second.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Well, if you can't make it, I can tell you what he says. Alana, okay. Are we going to be able to do it? No.
Okay.
Well,
yeah, it's loading. Sorry, 1 second.
Okay.
Okay, let's skip that
one.
Oh, you got it?
All right.
1, 2, 3. Okay, let's skip that. So he says, you know, Jews are my enemies. They're the sons of Satan, the spawn of Satan. They control everything in the world. They're my personal enemies. And and he's, as I said, he's got a huge influence. So what can we possibly do to respond to this? So take notes, people. So next slide. Arabs and Muslims indeed have black slaves today, as you watch me say this, in 5 African countries. All the information that you need is on our website, iabolish.org. We have pictures, documents, and videos. So let's take a quick look at this. And Ilana, you can go slide to slide as you hear me talk. So in Sudan, there are maybe 30,000 slaves left in the hands of Arab Muslim masters after a decades-long self-declared jihad waged by the Islamist rulers of Khartoum against the black, mostly Christian South. That war ended. About 2 to 3 million blacks were killed. Christians call this the Hidden Holocaust. And tens of thousands of black women and children were captured, enslaved, raped, bought and sold, traded for cash and camels. I went to Sudan 3 times with a Christian group, a heroic Christian group. We redeemed thousands of slaves by paying cash for their freedom. We knew it happened. President Bush, when he learned about this, forced a partition on the country, and South Sudan is now the world's newest nation, having pretty much defeated the Arab Islamist might and jihad in the north. And there are many people in South Sudan who think of themselves as the second Israel because they are, in a way. Mauritania is the most interesting one when it gets to be our topic, because Muslims conquered Mauritania around the beginning of the 8th century. They converted the blacks, most of them, to Islam, and still they enslaved them. So as in the West, they weren't supposed to do that. As in the West, racism trumps religious doctrine. And today, there are between 350 and 650,000 black Muslim slaves still serving Arabo-Berber masters. You see there's a photo there of the slave girl on the right. She's serving her master's tea. In Nigeria, there's a jihad. This is country number 3. There's a jihad, much like there was in Sudan, on the Christian blacks, where villages are stormed. Girls and women are taken as slaves. They don't take men as slaves. Usually they take the girls and the women, because the whole idea is to increase the culture of Islam through the womb of the slave woman. You might recall that for about 3.5 minutes, Michelle Obama was interested in that. And she did her, bring back our girls, save our girls hashtag. But then somebody must have talked to her about what this was really about, and she got quiet very quickly. So the blacks are fleeing the violence in Africa, where there are jihads, little jihads, big jihads, and they're fleeing north, trying to get to, many of them are trying to get to Europe. And in Algeria and Libya, they're captured and sold. And the number there, according to the Global Slavery Index, are something about 50,000 to 100,000 slaves. We have an image here from CNN, and this was a video that CNN did of an actual auction of a black man who was sold eventually for $400. So that's the data. So there are wild estimates, nobody really knows, but there are estimates between 500,000 and 800,000 black slaves today serving Arab and Muslim masters. Don't forget that in Nigeria, these are black African Muslims waging jihad against black Christians, black African Christians. Again, you can see all of this and much more on my website, iAbolish. So now let's step back. So intersectionality is the idea that all victim groups in America need to band together against white oppressors. And this, as we all know, has had the consequence of tossing the Jews out of the left, because we're now defined as white, and because we are also portrayed as oppressing, needlessly oppressing, darker-skinned, indigenous, innocent Palestinians. And as Caroline explained, Black Lives Matter which, by the way, is a feeling. You know, the genius of that title is the power of it, because if you're anybody and you saw a policeman murder George Floyd in that way, you would feel, hey, you know, it's a natural feeling to say, hey, Black Lives Matter. What are you doing? But as Caroline explained, it's not the sentiment that's the problem about that murder, or about policing that goes bad. It's the organization behind it, and there are, if you look at Discover the Networks, which is a great site, you can find out that there are very important big money people, including George Soros, who are behind funding all of these groups who have turned viciously and who are trying to make the rest of the Blacks who are lured into this for not bad reasons feeling into being anti-Semitic. So this is a clear and present danger to the Jews. One more clear and present danger to the Jews. But what would happen if, I keep saying, Blacks found out that Arabs have Black slaves today? And what if Blacks told Arab and Muslim Americans to take a knee about that? Gee, you know, you can't, I want Caroline, if she's got this great thing called Latima, which is a satirical drama that she does. And I think it'd be great satire to have Professor Cornel West saying, gee, you know, we love the fact that the Arabs and the Muslims have joined us in Black Lives Matter, but I just found out that they have Black slaves over there. So could you pause before you join us next time and see what you could do about that? Anyway, Farrakhan in 1996, we caught him denying that Arabs and Muslims have Black slaves. Why would he, the champion of his race, do such a thing? Because his mission is to persuade American Blacks that Islam is their path to freedom. And reports of Muslims and Arabs enslaving Blacks, and especially enslaving Black Muslims, might just be an obstacle to that. And so he denied it. I don't know if, Alana, you could play that little clip where Farrakhan is denying it. Just try it once and then we'll go on. Can you tell me if you can?
Yes, I can. I figured out what the problem was.
Okay, so just play that.
Don't you go? If slavery exists, why don't you go as a member of the press? And you look inside of the Sudan, and if you find it, then you come back and tell the American people what you have found.
Okay, that's good. So what happened was, that was at a New York City press conference, and two reporters from the Baltimore Sun, you can go to the next slide, were challenged to do it, and they were sent to Sudan with our partners, Christian Solidarity International, and they bought the freedom of a couple of slaves, and they wrote, I think, a 5-part series on the front page, and they got a Pulitzer, or were nominated for a Pulitzer, and then Farrakhan ran away from the battlefield on that. He just, he lost. There were fistfights in jails between Black nationalists and Farrakhaners about this issue. We had an enormous support of, we had the NAACP on our side. We had Congressman Donald Payne from New Jersey. We had Eleanor Holmes Norton. Martin Luther King's wife was on our side. So this is a powerful thing. And at the moment, I have been thinking of trying to rekindle the anti-slavery movement, not only for ideological purposes, but also we have freed a lot of slaves and we created a new country. And I think if people in America knew, Blacks and whites, that we had a duty to free slaves, a lot of things could happen. Especially, I'm interested in the Nigerian American community, which is a very well-developed diaspora group with doctors, lawyers, pharmacists, etc. And their people are being murdered, and they're a little hesitant. They're too hesitant at this point anyway, to get involved in getting Americans and American blacks especially to care about this. But I think that's what should happen. It was about 20 years ago today, I think you have a slide, that I wrote in the Boston Globe, and I think we can mark this as one of the beginnings of when the left got woke. And they got woke by abandoning black slaves. The left is supposed to be at its base, all caring about these things. And they didn't really come aboard. A few did. And I think now the same issue is that why are people who claim to be on the left and who care about human rights, why are they specifically looking away from what is heinous, the ongoing enslavement of black people? This is chattel slaves. These people can be bought and sold. They're passed on to the next generation as furniture is from an estate. So I'm looking for help to get black leaders, conservative blacks interested in this. I have all the data. I have friends who can get them to the right places in Africa to do it. So I think that's what I have to say. You're muted.
Okay. Thank you so much for this unbelievably chilling presentation. Look, I would like to go on record as saying that there is some racism. There's obviously some racism in the United States, but whether or not, I felt compelled to demonstrate when I saw the knee on the throat of George Floyd as an American Jew. But when I hear that our people are not welcome, and that there is this systemic anti-Semitism within the movement, then I have to step away. And I have to tell you, in terms of what happened where the press does not cover these outrageous stories, Charles, that you've spent so much of your life uncovering?
Well,
how do you account?
The press covered a bit.
Very briefly, briefly.
I think the reason is that postmodernism is that the real story is the evil of white people and the West. And this is a distraction. It's the same. I mean, Caroline could tell you the same story about why the press doesn't cover terrible things that Palestinians do. It's the same answer. It's because we are beating our chests because we're guilty. We have incorporated all of the guilt of the left that's laid upon our heads. We think we live on unearned wealth. We think we have all the power in the world. We stole the land from the Indians. We have black slaves. So it's we who have to change. And if you talk about who are we who had slaves to talk about others, but more, if you do that, it's the same thing as why don't you talk about all the kids in Chicago who are being murdered by black thugs? It's the exact same thing. If you do that, you're distracting from the main narrative, which is that we're bad. We're the bad guys. And it's on us to change the world by bowing, kneeling, whatever we have to do. So this has two evil consequences. First, where it's against Israel, it's anti-Semitic. Where it's against the West, it's anti-Western, it's anti-Enlightenment. But really, even more deeply, if you're a left-wing person or if you're a liberal person, this is an abandonment of people who most need Western civil rights power. Who more than black slaves would want the Enlightenment to be revivified and not to be crushed? Who else is going to take care to go to Africa and free slaves but a vibrant Western civilization? So it's a double sin, and I think we know where it comes from, and it comes from postmodernism.
Thank you, Charles. And Carolyn, you have been working vociferously on a book about American Jewry. What is it about the American Jewish diaspora mindset that makes us abandon the plight of our own people and take up the charge of everyone else's?
Well, that's a very large question. And I think, one of the things that has to be borne in mind, I guess there are two things that have to be borne in mind about the uniqueness of the American Jewish community. For a lot of reasonable, really good reasons, the American Jewish community always saw itself as very different from all the other diaspora communities of the Jewish people throughout time. Upon arrival, basically, in the British colonies, even before the revolution and certainly afterwards, at a time when most Jews in Europe and really and throughout the world had no concept of the rights of citizenship and never even dreamed of having equal rights of citizenship with non-Jews. American Jews were automatically granted that and granted freedom of religion, freedom of worship. Yes, there was anti-Semitism in various forms in the United States throughout, but the legal status of Jews in the United States was the same as non-Jews, more or less, from the outset of the United States of America. So you could understand why American Jews would not view themselves as part and parcel of the wider fabric of Jewish people and Jewish diaspora life. And so I think, from the outset, you had a sense among American Jews that they were not part of Jewish history, that they were outside the fate of the Jewish people. And as such, Jewish history didn't touch them. Anti-Semitism didn't affect them the way that it did all other Jews throughout the world and throughout history. And that as a result, they really could act in a different way. And that's one of the reasons why you also had a lot of diffidence and opposition of American Jews to Zionism and to the establishment of Israel in the 1920s through 1948. The vast majority of Americans only became supportive of the establishment of a Jewish state after the Holocaust. So I think that that's part of it. And another part of it is that the Reform Judaism really came into its own almost immediately after it was formed in Germany in the American Jewish community. And the Reform movement at the time, and now increasingly today, reject Jewish peoplehood. They reject that the Jews are a nation. They from the outset, they rejected any ties to the land of Israel. And they wanted as much as they possibly could to be similar to, if not indistinguishable from, Protestant Christianity. Judah Magnus, who was the rabbi of one of the big Reform synagogues in New York, bragged to his congregants that a non-Jew who visited their synagogue on their Sunday services told him that it took him till 3/4 of the way through the service to even understand that he was in a synagogue and not in a church. And they saw this as a badge of honor. So, you had this intense desire on the part of the Reform Jewish movement to walk away from Jewish peoplehood. And when you have that kind of pedigree in a movement that now, for many years, has been the largest Jewish religious movement, you're going to have extreme diffidence on the part of its members to anything that is related to Jewish solidarity and to standing up, because that was the other thing, which is that the concept of tikkun olam, of repairing the world, is universalism. And it rejects the particularism of the Jewish community and of the Jewish people, and is very willing from the outset to give up on communal interests in favor of universal causes. And they see this as a redefinition of what Judaism is. And so you're seeing this, play out today on a lot of different levels, but most importantly, I think, is really the physical safety level. Because, after the massacre at the Tree of Life Synagogue, and then the attempted massacre at the Chabad House in Poway, California, you had Jewish organizations that were reasonably saying we have to expand our operation in coordination with the local police forces. We have to train our members to defend ourselves from would-be murderers who want to come in and kill the Jews. And now you're seeing leading Jews supporting the defunding of the police, standing with a movement that wants to criminalize policing in the United States, castigate police as the enemy of the people instead of the protectors. In the case of the Jews, first, of the Jewish community, the guardians of the Jewish community. And this is pathological behavior. The Jewish, any Jew who wants to harm the police when the police are defending them and protecting them is acting not only against the interests of American society and having law and order, but is specifically endangering himself and his community members. And so, that's the level that this kind of a denial of Jewish rights on behalf of other people, even those like the Black Lives Movement, Matters movement, wish ill to that community and openly consort with and sympathize with the Nation of Islam and other anti-Semitic organizations. I think that you see here a pathological behavior on the part of the American Jewish community.
Right. On Capitol Hill, I'm often asked about this, why, especially among Republicans and conservatives, why so many American Jews identify themselves with the liberal left. And I've often said 2,000 years of wandering in the diaspora has had a very deleterious effect on our collective psyches, where we want the love of the world. And we say, we're not like those Zionists, we're not like those religious, we're not like those Likudniks, we're liberal, we care for the Palestinian cause, love us, please love us. And it's this craving for love. But
Sarah, could I say something for a second? Yeah. All of these problems come to the same root, it seems to me. The Jews is a perfect storm. We're attacked by the right, the left, the Islamists, the Farrakhaners, the Black anti-Semites, okay? So all of the Jewish groups who are doing work against those forces are doing great work. But the biggest problem is failed Jewish leadership, right? How in the world can we, all of our small groups, with the greatest, most eloquent voices, and the bravest of the brave, how can we possibly defeat our external enemies if we have got a Jewish leadership, and I mean in all of the major organizations, except for ZOA, and all of the major organizations who have capitulated, who have become tikkunistas, as I say, who won't fight because they're conflict averse, because they're cowards, because they have really no understanding of what the new anti-Semitism was and is, and because they think that by embracing the left, which is now kicking us all in the teeth and kicking them in the teeth, that this is the only way they can go, right? So what I think has to happen is that we have to form a separate, alternative Jewish organization that says to the press, if you really want to know what the Jews think, don't go to the federations, don't go to ADL, don't go to the JCRCs, my God, or most every Reform rabbi, not all, most every Reform rabbi, that we are, I think Caroline and Melanie Phillips said it in one of your previous webinars, one of the best ones, that we're 1 million to 1.5 million Jews who think like we do, and we are unorganized. And I think, a big problem about that is that we don't want to come and fight the establishment Jewish organizations, but we have to.
On that note, Charles, I think it's important. I was always averse to the idea of forming a separate organization. I mean, even in the Zionist movement, I think that, Zev Jabotinsky was mistaken for leaving the Zionist executive and starting the revisionist Zionist group. That was a mistake on his part. And I thought that it was a mistake when the idea was raised in the past. But now, when you have the radical left in the form of the former chairman of HIAS, which is a post-Jewish organization, being elected in a really corrupt procedure to be the next chairman of the Council of Major American Jewish Organizations, Diane Laub, you know, you have a real problem on your hand, because you're going to see, you know, there was a huge fight, if you recall. I mean, we were all engaged in it to keep J Street, which is an anti-Israel pressure organization funded by anti-Israel non-Jews largely, and Soros, keeping them out of the Conference of Presidents. But the minute that comes in, and she's going to be inducted in a year, they'll be invited in, and so maybe will organizations like If Not Now, Jewish Voice for Peace, which are openly anti-Semitic organizations, and then you already have, like you said, the ADL and APEC to a large degree has been totally neutered by J Street, and they're not presenting the position of many Jews. Now, it is important, though, to bear in mind that these Jews who are standing with Black Lives Matter against communal interests are, in fact, the majority of American Jews. And here, I think it's important not only to recognize that it's a legacy of 2,000 years of truly horrific persecution of Jews since the destruction of the Second Temple. I think it's also a legacy of an American Jewish community that thought that it was operating outside of the Jewish people, and that cut itself off from its own people to try to join melange first of just general Americanism, and really since the early 20th century, since the Roosevelt administration, part of the left in the United States. And what we saw was that when the left in the United States was supportive of Zionism, was supportive of Israel, the American Jewish community was very happy to support Israel and be Zionist. But when the left began walking away from Israel and turning and becoming hostile towards Israel, which started in force beginning after the Six-Day War, when the Soviet Union cut off its ties with Israel, you saw, I wouldn't say a rush for the exits by the American Jewish community in terms of support for Israel, but you've seen a constant diminishment of American Jewish support for Israel, because across time, the decision of most of them has been to maintain their membership in the left, even at the cost of their Jewish identity. And now what we're seeing with the, what Charles called the tikkunistas, with the tikkun olam, a cult, is an attempt to replace actual Judaism with a new meaning of Judaism, which is essentially just an embrace of leftist politics as Jews.
Right, right. And how they have distilled tikkun, all of the 613 commandments of the Torah down to tikkun olam, and a misreading of the phrase at that. The real phrase is tikkun olam l'malchut Shaddai, for kingdom of God. We have so many people who have wanted to contribute to this discussion, and I am going to ask Benjamin Whale, who's the director of our Project for Israel Security, to please read some of the many questions that have come in. And if it's okay with you, Charles and Carol, perhaps we'll stay a little bit longer, because this discussion is so fascinating.
Sure.
So we will go beyond the 1 hour limit, if that's okay. Go ahead, Benjamin.
Thank you, Sarah. So the first question that came in, just a year ago on June 30th, 2019, the killing of Solomon Taka by the Israeli police sparked protests in Israel. What are the similarities and differences between the Ethiopian struggle in Israel and the Black Lives Matter movement here in the United States in regards to police brutality?
I think that's an important question, because I think the incident with Taka was immediately exploited by far left organizations to draw a parallel between the alleged police racism in the United States and alleged police racism in Israel. And we've seen efforts by particularly the New Israel Fund and its to try to radicalize the community in Israel, to make them feel that they're being discriminated against by Israeli authorities and most importantly by Israeli society because of the color of their skin, when, you know, this is not true. There is racism in Israel. Israel is not free from racism. And there are many Ethiopian Israelis who have suffered from racism on the basis of their skin color. But to say that this is endemic to Israel is false. To say that it's endemic to the police department in Israel is also false. At the same time, Israel has taken great measures to try to improve the situation in terms of any sort of racism inside of the police or other government structures. For instance, in the new government, the deputy police minister, who among other things is in charge of rectifying any racism towards Ethiopian Israelis, is from the community, is an Ethiopian Israeli. So I think, Israel is making great efforts. The government has, the police have, and all organs of the state have to both correct any problems in terms of the relationship between those institutions, particularly the police and the Ethiopian Israeli community. And also you're seeing a very clear campaign being carried out by American Jewish organizations to radicalize the Ethiopian Jewish community in Israel, to cultivate a sense of grievance and discrimination by Ethiopian Jews that they had not expressed in the past. So one could say they're being empowered, but it's also very clear that this is not about empowering Ethiopian Jews per se, but in turning them into a grievance community in Israel to try to present Israel abroad as a racist country in support of efforts by anti-Semites in the United States to delegitimize the very existence of the Jewish state.
Thank you. Benjamin?
Next question. It seems that BLM is effective in fighting the system by claiming there is a structural bias, while anti-Semitism is blaming it on people for being anti-Semitic. If we want to be more effective in addressing anti-Semitism, should we consider changing the rhetoric and mark the system rather than the people?
Charles, you want to get this right?
I'm not sure what that means. There are systemic anti-Semitic bits in this. I mean, anti-Semitism is systemic because it's been with us for 2,000 years. It's in the lifeblood of a faction of Western civilization. I don't think it's, I'm not sure.
This is a question for Caroline. Given the problems you have identified with BLM and related groups, how can well-meaning Zionist American Jews openly support the Black community in light of recent police murders and racial injustice? Are there Black-led organizations involved in these issues that you have identified and endorse?
I mean, I think that there are a lot of great Black organizations. I think that, Candace Owens has the Blexit movement, which is trying to help Blacks realize that the Democratic Party since the 1960s has been instrumental in causing all of the damage to the nuclear family in the Black community by incentivizing non-marriage. I think that, there and beyond that. And I think that she deserves to be supported because I think what she's trying to do, look, I mean, American Jews and Jews in general, and really people, good people, should be trying to help people to help themselves. And if you're talking about empowering Blacks, you don't do that by cultivating a sense of victimization. You do that by cultivating a sense of empowerment. And the way to empower people, whether they're Jews or whether they're Blacks or what, is to make them believe that they can do things and that they can command respect, not pity, not patronization, but actual respect, and that they're just as, they're equals, and that they should be treated as equals, and that the Democrats are putting them into a framework that blocks them from advancing as individuals or as a community. And I think that, it's very important to support Black Americans and Black American organizations that reject the idea that everybody who's born with dark skin is a priori and always a victim. That's not how you should be raising people. That's not how you should be treating people. I mean, I don't want to be treated as a victim. One of the things that I took issue with during the Palestinian terror campaign against Israel was this view of the foreign ministry that we were supposed to highlight Jewish victimization. I mean, I can understand why we had to highlight the monstrosity that is Palestinian terrorism and jihad, and to show the human toll that it takes. But you don't inspire people by presenting yourself as a victim. And, you know, I think that the way that you empower people is by defeating your enemies and not being a victim. And I think that one of the major enemies of the Black community and the Jewish community in the United States is the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party that tells Blacks that they're supposed to be victims and that they're a grievance community, as opposed to Americans who have equal rights with everybody else and should be treated with respect and with the right to choose to live any way that they want to live, and not to be told that they have to live one way or another. And the Jews are being abused because they're being told that they're not going to be in polite company anymore if they don't accept positions that are antithetical to their interests and their civil rights as Jews in the United States. So, you know, I think that people should be supporting organizations that are empowering Blacks to stand up for themselves. I also, you know, there are some really excellent Black leaders like Dumisani Washington, who's in charge of a Black outreach from Kufi. And I think that his efforts should be supported. Look, I think that when you stand with your friends and oppose to your enemies, and people want to be your friends and they don't want to be your enemies, Israel and the Jewish community have allies and friends inside of the Black community. Some of them are in positions of power. Some of them ought to be in positions of authority and power inside of the community. There are pastors in Chicago that I remember my father used to work with, of blessed memory, when he was a ward committee on the south side of Chicago, and they were excellent, and they were excellent leaders of their own communities. And I think that these are things that people should take upon themselves. Don't just accept that because an organization is getting a lot of airtime on TV, that they're representative of the interests of Blacks, and they're certainly not representative of the interests of Black-Jewish cooperation. You should seek out the Blacks who seek your help and are your friends, and then you'll empower them. I think that that's the best thing that American Jews can do for themselves. And
Benjamin, can I go back to the last question for just a comment? I don't think it's a matter of fighting anti-Semitism as a matter of it being structural or not structural or personal. But I do think that the one truth that we don't express, which incorporates everything that's happening to us. If I had a banner to fight anti-Semitism, it would be something like, they're lying about the Jews again. Because in every corner where we're being attacked, it's led by lies. It's led by lies about Israel, about American Jewish behavior, about the amount of control and power we have, about the Talmud. So that, if I were leading a movement to fight anti-Semitism, that would be the banner organizing principle. Their lies are the things that get us killed in the end, and they're lying about the Jews again in many different ways. So, yeah.
Thank you. And actually, the next question is for you as well, Charles. You mentioned Jewish leadership earlier. Is there, or can there even be, a prominent Jewish leader in the Black Lives Matter movement to speak out and prevent anti-Semitism within the movement?
Well, I think Caroline mentioned a Jewish leader. I don't know if there can be. I mean, all Jewish leaders should do it. Who would be most effective? I don't know. I think we already have, as Caroline said, lots of powerful Black allies. Shelby Steele, Thomas Sowell. We have Dumasani's son, Joshua Washington, who just started something interesting and new. There's Candace. We might want to think of having a convention of 10 of those guys in a room, speaking out against the anti-Semitism in the Black community, or in the Black Lives Matter movement. That would be something that somebody should fund and somebody should organize.
How can we combat BLM anti-Semitism when we aren't presenting a united front? Most of the establishment Jewish organizations either support BLM or avoid the issue, and self-styled progressive Jews actively support BDS and anti-Zionism.
There's no united front. There's never going to be a united front. The Jews are divided. It's not a new story. So that's why there has to be a coalition of Jews who think like us, not one group, a coalition of groups who think like us, who make a statement. We are the Jews who think this way, and we think we're the most Jewish and we're the most right. So forget about united front.
There's that famous joke of 2 Jews, 3 opinions. So I guess that,
Right.
supports that.
And going back to the Beit Hillel, Beit Shammai, the house of Hillel and the house of Shammai, and there's always been a dissent. That's where we study with reverence the voice of dissent in the Talmud. And we are the voice of dissent here. There were just 400 Jewish organizations that signed on to the Black Lives Matter movement.
Right.
No, I am not going to support a movement that says Black Lives Matter, Palestinian Lives Matter, and just talks about these egregious lies about the state of Israel. I'm sorry. So I am with you, Charles. Charles has been trying to form an alternative to the Conference of Presidents. And I have to say that when the president of HIAS was elected as the lay leader of the Conference of Presidents, that was an outrage, because even 17 years ago, when I was the director of the Washington office of the American Jewish Congress, I was given something by HIAS to sign saying that Muslims are being discriminated against in their entree to this country, and they wanted to get more Muslims into this country. And I said, wait a minute, they don't like us. Those that have been socialized in Islamic schools are taught to hate us. This will affect our children and grandchildren. So they went above my head to my executive director in New York and had it signed. So this has been going on forever. And they are not really working for the interests of the American Jewish community at this point. So Charles, kol hakavod, more power to you for trying to start this. I know it's hard. It's none of the tasks that any of us have taken on are easy. Anyway, Benjamin, are there more questions that have come in?
There are plenty more questions to keep us occupied for the next couple of days, I think.
Okay. Anything that is very, very important I see one question just came in. How would, Charles, what you're asking for, how would that be different from the ZOA?
It would be an umbrella group that would include the ZOA. I mean, I imagine the ZOA would have a lot to say in a group such as this. But there are, Caroline is right, there are 1 million to 1.5 million Jews in America who are unorganized when it comes to telling the rest of the world that Jewish leaders have failed us and they don't speak in our voice. And that is on us. We have to fix that. It's not easy. You try to get 6 Jews in a room and agree, but it doesn't have to be an organization. It can be an umbrella group. And I think we need to do it, and I'm trying to do it. So
wonderful. I want to, first of all, before we sign up, thank our incredibly gifted panelists. Carolyn Glick, you are really a light into the nations, coming forth from Zion, and you've contributed so much. And Charles, you are an unsung hero. I know that you've traveled to Africa, multiple times, have tried to free Blacks from their oppression and slavery, and have given birth to so many wonderful organizations. Both of you are excellent, excellent human beings.
And Sarah, you are the sword of the Jews in Washington.
Anyway, I am honored to be friends with both of you. Really proud honored and proud. And I would like, to thank you all. One of our board members has said, please remember to tell people to, if you want to see more programs such as this, everything costs us money. So please go onto our website at emetonline.org and please support us. We are a small organization that punches way above our weight and take on the big issues that some other organizations won't dare to touch. So I really do need your support to be able to continue to provide programs such as this. And thank you so much for the amazing contribution. And thanks to everyone for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.